it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Matthew Dimick from SUNY Buffalo Law School as our Douglas Cunningham Visitor in Labor and Employment Law. I saw Matt speak at the Labor Law Research Network Conference in Barcelona last year, and I was so intrigued by what he was talking about and his methods that I thought, I wonder what else he's working on. We've got to get this guy to come talk to us. Matt is interested in how labor market institutions such as labor and employment legislation or trade unions, collective bargaining, influence the distribution of income and the efficiency and productive efficiency of the labor market. He teaches in labor and employment law, but also in corporate law and tax law. He is a fellow at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University, in addition to his work at SUNY Buffalo. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Matt, and please make him feel welcome here in Queens.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you especially to Kevin for inviting me. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Like Kevin said, I'm from Buffalo, which I think you can think of as just the opposite end of the lake. So, you know, if you're thinking of it that way, we're close neighbors, right? So to give a little background for this talk, I originally wrote this paper for a law review symposium at University of California, Irvine. And the question, I think the title of the conference was Reimagining Labor Law. And so the motivating question of the conference was, do unions have a future? And if so, what do they need to do to seize that future? So this paper collects my thoughts on those issues. So at least in the United States, but I suspect to a certain extent in Canada as well, there is, at least among a certain group of the population, unions have a certain connotation, right? Bad for productivity, just like this cartoon shows. Now, I'm going to agree with the critics, but only to a point, right? So often the presumed question is, are unions bad for productivity? I actually think that's the wrong question. The question should be, what kinds of unions are good or bad for productivity? And basically my argument is that unions that bargain on a decentralized basis are worse for productivity than unions that bargain on a more centralized basis, and that this has lots of different implications, right? So when I say productivity and its impact, I don't necessarily mean productivity is good for its own sake, right? If the right distributive institutions are in place, like unions, more productivity can help make workers' lives better off, and that's a good thing. Also, I think maybe more specifically, if unions have a positive or at least less negative impact on productivity, it's going to reduce opposition from employers. And according to at least most American legal scholars, employer opposition is, exhibit A in the reason for why unions have declined in the United States to such a great extent. So if we can address employer opposition, right, that's no small issue. Okay, let me talk first about, give you some comparative and historical context. I find this is an easier way to get into some abstract topics if we start with some of the history first. So basically, countries vary quite dramatically in terms of how centralized their bargaining is. And when I say centralized bargaining, I primarily mean the level at which unions bargain, right? So starting at the most decentralized level, you can have a firm, or excuse me, a union bargain at a single workplace with an employer, right? Moving more centralized, a union could bargain with a firm covering several workplaces. Going further, a union could bargain with an employers association that covers an entire industry. And then even further than that, in some countries, over quite substantial periods of time, unions have bargained with an employers association covering all industries in a nation. So there's quite a different number of levels of centralization, and you do see quite a bit of variation across countries when it comes to this variable. All right, so why do we have such difference across countries? I think there are really basically two reasons. The first has to do with the timing that the country industrialized. And then the second has to do with the timing of democratization in the country. So let's start with countries like the United States and other Anglo-American countries. Industrialization in these countries arrived earlier, came with smaller scale technology. Work was generally highly skilled, required to be highly skilled to produce in these sectors, and trade was relatively local, right? So this had several implications. First, unions formed on the basis of skill, right? We call these craft unions because that was the kind of production that prevailed at the time. And the way craft unions advanced the interests of their members was essentially by protecting and monopolizing the skill, right? So that involved restricting or excluding others without that skill from engaging in that kind of work. And it also meant confronting employers over issues of technological change or workplace organization, right? Technology and how work was organized, these were all things that could threaten the skill. So often craft unions were at loggerheads with employers with respect to these things, right? And this is captured, I think, by this term really well that I like called job control, right? So craft unions would try and impose on employers all these rules, job demarcations, setting up job territories, rules against skill dilution, so on and so forth. Part of the crowning achievement, as Wolfgang Streck calls it, of craft unions was the closed shop, right? So employers could only hire members of the union if they wanted to hire a new employee. All right, and that's all the timing of industrialization and why that matters. Now, also, right, especially in the United States, where you had democracy relatively early, you also had less political opposition or suppression of unions, right? In the United States, at least, unions per se were never legally banned, ever. And even earlier on, the legal restrictions on unions were relatively light. This changed later in the 19th century, but in the early 19th century, opposition to unions were very mild. Another key feature of craft unionism was that it was highly decentralized, right? So because they had a monopoly of skill, because markets tended to be more local, this fit well with a very decentralized structure. And in fact, when Samuel Gompers organized the American Federation of Labor, local autonomy was essentially a founding principle. All right, so all these things get built into the structure of labor unions and labor bargaining because of these factors. If we go to continental Europe, it's a very different story, right? So industrialization came later. When industrialization came, it came when large factories employing unskilled or semi-skilled work, right? So craft unions really had no fit in this kind of context. Also, unions were often banned outright, right? So here you have a picture of the blacksmiths on strike, and the Kaiser's troops are here ready to gun them down. All right, so what this meant in terms of unions and their organization is they often had to organize on a much universal basis because they couldn't organize on skill, and they're often shut out from the workplace itself. It often put them in a more political posture compared to the craft unions. To quote Wolfgang Streck again, I can't say it better than he does, so I'm just going to read what he says, talking about industrial unions in Europe. Organizing across trades, industrial unions had little use for job control. And organizing industry-wide across employers, they preferred centralized collective bargaining to make the economic situation of workers as independent from that of their employer as possible. Rather than challenging the right of employers to reorganize work and introduce new technology, industrial unions defended the occupational skills of their members through involvement in industrial training and public labor market policy. So unions in Europe never contested as much the micro politics of the workplace, if you want to do that. They didn't try and control the deployment of technology or the organization of work like craft unions did in the United States. So that's some of the comparative and historical background for some of these differences, why unions tend to be more decentralized in countries like the United States and more centralized in some European countries. So now to give you kind of an overview of some of these differences, this table has a variety of different measures of centralization. I won't get into the details. That's not important at this point. What is important is, if you group these countries into these three groups, what you see is across virtually every measure, countries like the United States are the least centralized. Social democratic or Scandinavian countries are the most centralized. And then what we call continental European countries are somewhere in the middle in terms of how centralized they are. You can also look at this over time. Basically, it's the same story, right? So we have countries like Norway and Sweden are here at these two lines at the top. You've got United States, the United Kingdom, again at the bottom, the least centralized. And then you have countries like Belgium, Germany, and Japan in the middle. So same message. I think what this shows is that there is, you do see variation over time, but despite that, countries pretty much stick where they begin. All right, so that's a little background on union structures, what they are, how they differ across countries, and why they differ. I'm going to talk now about why bargaining structures matter, what the consequences of bargaining structures are. The first follows closely from some of the discussion I introduced earlier about craft unions. And that is how unions respond to risk in the labor market, right? So unions, one of their goals, of course, is to improve wages, but I think addressing risk in the labor market is another central thing that unions do, right? So workers have specific skills that often can't be used just in any job, right? And so there's always a risk from losing that job. And so unions often, in whatever form, address that issue. They address it in different ways, though, depending on how centralized their bargaining is or not. So in decentralized situations, I think it best about this way. So if a union is bargaining with a single employer, either a single workplace or a single firm, right, they have no control over what's going on in the external labor market, right? And there are a lot of bad jobs out there, right? And so being unable to control external conditions, right, their best response is to try and control internal conditions, right? And so I think this is why you see things like seniority, job ladders, just cause restrictions on dismissal, all of these classic work rules that employers, notoriously hate, but unions in decentralized countries often impose on employers, right? So for unions in centralized situations, though, it's very, very different response. So when you're bargaining with an entire industry, for example, right, all of the terms in the agreement get applied to all employers in the industry. And so if I lose my job, I can be relatively assured that with my skill, if I get re-employed with that skill, it's going to be on very similar terms, right? I'm not going to lose that much if I get fired from my current job, because the conditions apply industry-wide. Centralized bargaining also often comes with, wage compression, what's called wage compression. So firms differ a lot within an industry in terms of how productive they are, and this influences wages. So if I'm at a very highly productive firm and have high wages, if I lose my job, even if I do get reemployed in the same industry, right, it could be within a less productive employer, and that means lower wages for me. So if centralized unions are able to compress wages across employers, then again, if that is the situation, if I lose my job, I'll know that I'll be rehired again at a similar wage. And so the posture of the union then is not to try and prevent dismissals as much as it is to impose conditions that are, as Wolfgang Strauch said in that quote earlier, impose conditions that are independent of any single employer, right? I think another difference is that unions that are centralized are also in a position, because they're more coordinated, to come up with political solutions to problems like labor market risk, right? So I think the best example of this is the Danish model of what they call flexicurity, right? So instead of having seniority rules or just cause restrictions at the firm level, right, in exchange they give employees very generous unemployment insurance, right? So you have different substitutes for managing labor market risk. All right, so this matters from the point of view of employers, right? An employer wants a free hand to organize work, and so if centralization gives them that, and we find other ways of addressing risk in the labor market, then this is perhaps something that employers can live with more than the dense web of employment rules that sometimes come with decentralized unions. So that's managing labor market risk. Another problem that centralization can address is what economists call a holdup problem. All right, so the classic example is an employer wants to make a big investment in a very specialized form of machinery, right? Not very much use in other industries, can't really resell it at the price that they bought it because it's a very specialized piece of equipment. Now this potentially can make the firm much more productive, right? But it also puts the union in a position to really drive up wages as well because of that increase in productivity. And so that puts the employer in a very vulnerable position, right? They want to increase productivity and profits through this investment, but if they do, they essentially are going to drive up wages at the same time, and that lessens the incentive to make those kinds of investments, right? And in the end, if the employer anticipates this problem, that just means overall less investment and everyone is worse off, right? Now that's actually how it works in decentralized bargaining. In centralized bargaining, again, it's very different, right? So if you bargain on a centralized basis, the wage is going to be some average of productivity across many employers. Right, so think of the employer's perspective now. If they make an investment, this is not going to change wages hardly at all, if any, right? And so now they don't have that disincentive to make that investment. And then because unions are there to bargain to at least share some of the gains, that can potentially make everyone better off. This applies to human capital as well, right? So the classic example is physical capital, but it applies to human capital as well. So, why should employers invest in the training of their workers if workers can go and take those skills and work at a different firm, right? No incentive for the employer to do that. Well, again, if wages are rigid, set by some industry term, by a centralized union, then again, if I increase the productivity of my employees, but wages are fixed, I stand to get the residual benefits of that. And so I think this is why in countries with more centralized bargaining, you do see much more employer investment in vocational training of the skills of their employees. And again, since employers probably have more resources than employees generally do to train. That potentially makes both employers and employees better off. All right, so those things together, I think, centralization, if you take those two economic benefits, those two productivity benefits, and put them together, that can help reduce employer opposition, right? So if the employer is getting something out of this centralization by increased investment in physical or human capital or more flexible internal labor markets, then they have less reason to impose unions to begin with. And so the implication of those two things, those increasing productivities, means less employer opposition. The fourth consequence has to do with income inequality. So there's a fairly strong relationship between centralization and inequality. So on this graph, the further right you are here, the more centralized your bargaining is. And then here is the further up you are, the more unequal the wage distribution is. And so as you can see, depending on how centralized bargaining is, it's a very strong negative relationship between the two. You may notice Canada is actually more unequal than the United States here. It's partly because I'm only including part of the wage distribution. And that may explain why. I don't know the full answer for why that is, but it may have to do with the fact that I'm only comparing the ratio of workers at the median to the bottom 10th percentile. I select that range because that's where centralization appears to have the biggest impact. That's kind of where you want the biggest impact, right? It raises the wages of those at the bottom more than it drags down the wages of those at the top. And so you know, those that need it are benefiting most from centralization. I guess that's the other way to put that story. All right, so those are some of the consequences of centralization. That's why I think it matters so much and why people should start thinking and talking about this more. In the paper, I also have I do a legal analysis. So I talk about, I raise the question of whether labor law is more of a cause or consequence of bargaining structure. And my tentative conclusion that is it's more of a consequence. And I think that's good news in the sense of that, that you may not need to have a massive or large change in the law if you do want to change your bargaining structure, which is not to say that changing your bargaining structure is an easy task, but it does take one of the issues out of the mix. So I'm not going to go into further detail about the legal aspect of it, but I'm happy to entertain questions later on about it. So let me talk now about, you know, is it possible to get there? How do we do it? And so I want to talk about three things that we can do to try and get there. You know, changes of this sort are big, and I don't have any illusions about what kind of challenge that is. But when you think about you know, the important differences across countries in terms of unions, this really looms up there. So I do think it at least deserves some thought. You know, if in the United States or Canada you were trying to make that change, that is a very, you know, long-term goal. But there are some ways, there are some things that we can do sort of in the shorter term to position unions for that, were it ever to be a possibility. And that can affect choices about how unions organize and how they bargain in the here and now, even if they're not leaping immediately to more centralized bargaining. And so the first one of these I call reorganizing unions. A second one I label breadth, not depth. And the third, less is more, is what I call. So I'm going to talk about each one of these in turn now. So mostly everything I've said, when I've said centralization, I'm referring to the level at which bargaining takes place between unions and employers. Well, it turns out that unions' own internal organization is very critical for how centralized your bargaining is. And by union authority, I mean things like who controls the strike fund? Is it the local union or the central federation? Who has the authority to bargain for the union? Is it the local union or the central federation, right? And so what you see is that the more that authority is centralized within the union, the more likely you are to have more centralized wage bargaining. Right? So this is something that unions, even if unions don't get bargaining centralization, this is something they can do within their own organization to position themselves for that. And I think, at least in the United States, the best example of this is the Service Employees International Union over the last few decades has done quite a bit to try and centralize authority within the union, not without resistance or controversy, but they have made these attempts. I should note too that this is different, right? Centralizing authority is different than just a union merger, right? So you could have unions merge, but that might not actually change the internal structure of the union. Okay, breadth, not depth. What do I mean by that? Unions, I think, should organize, I guess, in what some people would call a more minority union basis, right? So not go for 100% density within a given firm, but actually try and organize at least some workers across many different firms, right? And I think, at least again in the United States, the idea is that you want maximum density within the firm, but I think this has, again, a kind of backlash effect. So this slide compares, this slide compares union density, which is the percentage of union members in your workforce, with union coverage, which is the share of workers that are covered by a collective agreement, right? So usually the situation is you can have more union coverage than union density, because you can have, especially in right-to-work states like in the United States, you can have workers that are covered by an agreement, but not actually members of the union. And so I think it's common for us to think about, for example, again, the United States as being low density, Europe being high density, but it's actually more complicated than that, right? Usually it's actually dichotomous. It's actually extremely dichotomous, right? It's better to think actually in the United States that where unions exist, there's 100% density, but because this tends to provoke much more employer opposition, you get zero density everywhere else, right? In Europe, the membership is much more spread out. And again, I think that's another thing that can both, lead to more centralization later on if you organize workers in that way, breadth rather than depth, and in the here and now will reduce employer opposition. Now that may require making less demands on the employer, right? If you're weaker within the particular workplace, you may not be able to get the full, huge page-long contract that unions in the United States are accustomed to with every single goodie you can think of. But again, that may be a good thing. So maybe less is more. Unions perhaps should think about scaling back the objectives that they're accustomed to and just focus on the core things like wages, hours, and benefits. Now the concern there is, well, we're not addressing, if we reduce the scope of the bargaining agenda, the benefit there is, again, that may allow that may cause employers to oppose unions less. But then the objection is, well, we're not meeting a lot of concerns that workers have. So one way to address this is to adopt more, what they call sometimes dual channels of representation, right? And so actually you see this very commonly in more centralized, in countries with more centralized bargaining. Unions will set wages at an industry level, but then at a firm level, you'll have a more autonomous club or a works council that'll address worker concerns at the local level, often in a less contested way. Another benefit of that is it provides some mechanism for worker voice, for the union at the firm level, right? So one concern about more centralization of either bargaining or union structures itself, right, is it doesn't sound very democratic. But maybe going in this dual direction can get us to centralization, but also preserve a role for worker voice at the local level. So these are all things that I think unions can take steps to doing now that are short of centralized bargaining, but that can position unions for that if that were ever to be a future possibility, and that I don't think would take, it would take various amounts of adjustments, but they're at least more realizable in the short or medium term. And let me add, I think in many ways some unions are being forced to adopt this kind of position. I'm thinking here of the attempts to organize Walmart in the United States or the fast food campaigns, right, where they're bypassing the board certification election that'll confer exclusive representation and just trying to organize workers on a members-only basis, minority unions across many different workplaces over some central demand. $15 an hour is what the fast food workers campaign is working for. To me, that looks a lot like how bargaining works in more centralized countries, at least in embryo. And so unions in the United States may be being forced into this posture, if not choosing it outright. All right, I'll end there. I look forward to questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. At least you didn't have on the slide, and I was wondering if you looked into the emerging economies like China, Brazil, India.
Yeah, no, I have not really looked at the emerging economies. I've read a little bit of Cindy Estlin's stuff on China, and I'm trying to remember now what her main conclusion was there. It seems like in China you're maybe getting forced into some kind of dual representation because the official unions, right, are essentially controlled by the party state. And so that's forcing these autonomous workplace-based forms of organization at the local level. So it seems like it's decentralizing, but it's also, I think it has to be extremely informal, right? Because they're not officially recognized, and so it's not clear. It's not clear what direction, to me, that's going. If some of this local autonomy is able to pressure the official unions into doing something, you may see, I could see a more European model emerging. On the other hand, if all the power shifts to the local level, it could be a more American-style situation. But yeah, I know very little about the emerging market situation.
So just based on what happened last month in Chattanooga with UAW and Volkswagen,
Yeah.
and then Volkswagen's response, at least with their workers' council overseas, Germany rather.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? How that may play with another factor in the future?
Yeah. What are my thoughts on that? That was big. I was expecting the UAW to win that vote. I thought with the VW at least being officially neutral, and then sort of implicitly wanting the union there so that they could get the Works Council, that I thought it was a slam dunk for the UAW. So it surprised me a little bit that it didn't. I guess I wasn't paying. I didn't give enough credence to the anti-union campaigns that were being marshaled by outside groups and by some of the politicians. In terms of what, and I don't know how realistic it is for a solution like that to be achieved at other firms, right? I mean, the VW is pretty unique in having this experience in Germany, of course, and I think also the union in Germany putting pressure on VW to get to have a works council in the United States, and so I don't see that set of circumstances existing for many other plants or companies in the United States. It would be very interesting to see what would happen, how a works council in the United States would look like. In terms of how it would relate to centralization, the implication seems to be that it wouldn't have really any implication, right? Because the works council is already a very decentralized form of worker representation. In that sense, it fits very well with the American model. I think the idea of a works council is that it's more cooperative. I think it works that way in Germany because legally, in many ways, a works council is less strong legally than a recognized union is in the United States. We were talking about this last night. They can't strike, and they don't officially have power to bargain over wages, although it seems clear that they do have an informal influence on wages. One of the other things I mentioned in the paper about works council is how centralized bargaining actually provides a good environment for it. Because the central union addresses wages, it's more possible for employers and unions to open up these more contested workplace matters because they know that the central agreement covers really the key terms like wages, for example. And so I guess the implication of that is if you don't have centralized bargaining, you may not get works councils that function very well. And so, even if VW wanted it, right, it may not actually be a very feasible option without the industry level bargaining. So.
Hi, Matt. Thanks. I found your talk really intriguing because I come from Australia, and some of the theses that you were advancing sort of runs against the orthodoxy, I guess, that I've grown up around, right? So we had a very centralized mechanism for fixing wages and terms and conditions until the 80s, and then went towards a more decentralized enterprise level type bargaining system. And that was primarily because there was a view out there, especially advanced by employers, that decentralized wage fixing was better for productivity, and centralized wage fixing actually hampered productivity. And there's huge widespread employer opposition to centralized wage fixing. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, so a couple of thoughts. First, from the way I understand the older Australian situation, is that it proceeded much more through these tribunals, right? Rather than a case like Sweden, centralization was achieved mainly through voluntary agreements between the unions and the employers' associations, with actually relatively little state involvement, which should come as a surprise, right? Given that in terms of the welfare state, Sweden is very interventionist, if you want to call it that way. And so I guess the implication there, I don't know a whole lot about the Australian situation, but I think the implication of that is that perhaps employers were less invested in centralized bargaining in Australia because they weren't really the authors of it. The second thing is that we should add more recent context to this discussion of centralization, and that is that things like globalization and I think changes in monetary policy have made it hard to maintain centralization anywhere. Another of the big benefits to employers of centralization, right, is it's a way to actually contain rising wages, right? And with globalization, that itself has been a force to take off wage pressure from employers, and so At the same time, their interest in centralization is weakened. So, even in countries like Sweden that remain relatively much more centralized, there has been a move toward decentralization. So there's definitely other factors that explain why employers have this duplicitous approach to centralization. And so maybe some of that can explain the Australian case too.
So it's been a couple years since I read it, but when I read The Three Worlds of Welfare Capitalism by Dimick, the impression I got was that the difference in productivity was that like Anglo-Saxon countries would be really productive in high-tech, innovative industries. Continental European countries, their structure would allow them to be better at manufacturing, and then Scandinavian countries would be good at unskilled service. So it seems like you're arguing that in general, centralization of unions is good for productivity. And my impression of that book was that it was just different things different industries that benefit different structures.
Right. So, well, in the United States, if you have no unions, right, then your productivity problem is solved, right? And so that's one reason why there's so much employer opposition. Is if decentralized unions are a drag on productivity, then the employer's best response is just to get rid of unions altogether. And so, so that's why you could conclude that the United States has higher productivity, even though they have decentralized unions. Well, they don't have very many unions. That's why, right? In terms of, what you're saying reminds me of the varieties of capitalism literature and the idea that having different industrial relations structures help you have a comparative advantage in some industries or others. And the way I remember that is that in countries without unions that sometimes can't get the skill investment for the reasons I talked about earlier, right? Employers have no incentive to invest in general skills when employees can just take those anywhere. That those countries don't do well in getting a highly skilled manufacturing workforce, that they instead specialize in these radical innovations, right? So you be Apple and you come up with a great device, and you have very few people at the high end of the labor market that are good at coming up, the engineers who are good at coming up with the ideas. But then you actually offshore the production because some other regime does a better job of doing that. So, yeah, those are my thoughts there.
Matt, your three how to get there prescription: reorganizing unions, breadth, not depth, less and dual rather than single channel representation. That's very much a prescription for, I guess, basically the German and Dutch models. The problem perhaps is in the old cliche, it takes two to tango. Your number two and number three, breadth not depth, and dual channel requires a considerable degree of employer organization, which you have in Germany, you have in the Netherlands. You don't have it in really at all in the United States, or almost not at all in Canada. And what there was of it in Britain back in the 60s and 70s pretty well died during the Thatcher years. How do you get broad coverage bargaining and the upper level of collective bargaining that you need in a dual channel system without employer organizing?
Yeah. So when I say less is more, what I mean is the first step is that unions should try to organize basically a minority union at several workplaces rather than trying to organize a 100% union at one workplace. And if they can sustain some gains and hold the interest of at least some workers in that situation, then my hope is that you would get a broader coverage. And I think the way that might work is that, the classic way it works, right, is you whipsaw employers. You try and go for a gain in one workplace, and by putting pressure on a single employer, and do this successively. In any country, United States or Sweden, the employer response has always been to organize themselves as the best way to address that. And so, one other implication of that is that it may require a more confrontational use of contentious strike tactics, shall we say, right? And that's the way, in my paper, I think the one place where I say labor law reform would help would be to lessen some of the restrictions on things like secondary boycotts. And those kinds of tools can be used to place that kind of pressure on employers successively, that if done strategically, would force employers to organize themselves. It's fascinating if you read I think it's the Buffalo Linen, or Bonanno. It's a Supreme Court case in the United States, Bonanno. I can't remember the full name, Bonanno versus the NLRB. But it describes how this union established this multi-employer bargaining situation. It was through this use of whipsaw strikes. And then if you compare that with Peter Swenson's book, Capitalists Against Markets, to read about how centralized bargaining emerged in Sweden, it's the same exact playbook. And I think the real difference there is just scale and the extent of coordination among unions that explains why it emerged on such a much more limited basis in the United States.
So the productivity argument would be basically to try and reduce the propensity of the system to produce job control unionism. Decentralized systems also produce a kind of what industrial relations scholars refer to as a rule of law effect in the workplace. That web of rules is not just about seniority and restricting access to jobs and restricting the ability to restructure, but also implanting a local, indigenous dispute settlement process that allows norms to govern and be decided upon, and brings locally based power to bear in order to make say, a grievance arbitration system work. So my question is, does that sort of system need to be, do unions need to let go of the aspiration towards that, to achieve that kind of rule of law effect in order to move towards the kind of model that you're proposing? Should they? Does it have productivity implications? Is it otherwise problematic? And if not, how might it work under a more centralized model?
Yeah. So again, with centralization, you may come up with different ways of addressing the concerns that those web of rules, laws, the web of rules, the rule of law regime would address, right? So on the one hand, if again, my favorite example is flexicurity, right? If you provide very generous unemployment insurance, this reduces pressure at the local level to come up with, to ways to restrict the employer's decision on, where you work and if you're going to have a job the next day. The second thing is that for certain, right, centralization leaves a gap at the local level. And so I think that's where this dual representation comes in, right? So to the extent that centralization doesn't address anything at the local level, there is a scope for some other channel of representation to address those concerns. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, to a certain extent, but there are also some other values at stake, right? So just cause protection is partly about job control, but it's partly also about giving employees a sense that only relevant criteria will be used to decide on whether they get to keep their job or not. And, you know, that they're basically their boss can't treat them too unfairly.
Right.
And so I wonder if there isn't some of the, there might not be some deep reluctance on the part of unions, particularly in a country like Canada where, you know, that there's a downward trend in union density, but it hasn't reached a crisis point yet. And one of the big advantages that unions offer to their members is this kind of due process and check on at least what employees might perceive to be arbitrary management authority. And so how do you offer some kind of alternative to the model that's so locally based that would reassure people that it's okay to move in that direction?
Yeah, no, it's that in a lot of ways you can't, and I almost don't expect unions that are already bargaining that way to be able to do that, right? So this is less of a concern in the United States where density is so low that, you know, in some ways I'm just saying, you could just keep what exists the way it is, but we have this huge field now that's that workers have nothing at all, right? And so if you organize on a new basis there and it's more centralized, you know, even if you're only delivering wage increases or regulating hours or providing some other minimal benefits, that's going to be a huge step up from nothing, right? And maybe you can't really get the workers that have that that have union representation now in a very decentralized form in the United States. You might not be able to get them to give that up. And so that's that presents a bigger challenge in Canada where you still have higher density than you do in the United States, right? In the United States, you could at least say there's the whole open field. In Canada, you still have a relatively robust regime there.
Back to the slide that you had on centralization and the benefits for, I think there were 3 points. The first was labor market force, and then human capital and physical capital.
Yeah.
And then we talked about how that could decrease employer opposition.
Yeah.
I guess when I saw that, I'm a student, so I don't have a lot of practical experience, but from what we've learned in labor law courses, we see these sort of dramatic, maybe extreme cases where there really are rational actors. And it seems like, if you are assuming that employers take these things into consideration, you're assuming that they're acting rationally and with full information. So I was wondering, does this happen? Is it a process that, leave the Walmarts and the sort of very extreme cases aside?
Yeah.
How do you, if you want or if you need buy-in, if you got this, as Professor Bell was asking, this sort of, you need a bit of employer organization, how does that happen? How do you communicate these benefits?
Yeah. I mean, the biggest piece of evidence that centralization benefits employers is usually because it actually ends up being the employers that impose it on the unions, right? And the best example of this, again, is Sweden, right? So it was the strategy of unions in Sweden to try and whipsaw employers. They'd strike one employer, but let all the other employers operate, right? Which is actually the best thing you want to do, right? Because this employer is suffering. All its competitors are able to sell in the market, and it can't sell it. Not only is it hard for it to find replacement workers, but its goods are inferior to its competitors, right? So it really puts the employer in a double bind. And so unions would successively target each employer, and to get sort of the maximum rent they could extract from every single employer. And so, and then the response of employers was finally, well, let's organize together and then organize a giant multi-employer lockout. And they didn't want to destroy unions. They wanted to, had fixed terms that would apply to all workplaces. And so, so presumably, perhaps they were irrational in this. I think employers care about profit enough that there's enough of them that are relatively rational. That doesn't mean they have full information all the time, but they care about the bottom line. And so I think they did this because it improved their situation. They were in a situation where they couldn't, the unions were too strong, where they couldn't be destroyed, but at least by centralized bargaining, they could get something out of the deal. That was better than going up against the wall because of these whipsaw strikes. So that's my best evidence that this, right? And so that, that's still a kind of employer opposition. When I talk about employer opposition, I'm talking about the kind of employer opposition that wants to get rid of the union completely, right? And so there is evidence that employers will accept a kind of unionization as long as it's on a centralized basis.
So one of the intriguing things about your paper is that you have relatively little in the way of reform proposals with respect to U.S. labor law itself. And you alluded to this earlier in your talk and invited us to ask you about it. Given the number of lawyers and law students in the audience, I wonder if you could tell us how you get to that point where, in fact, you're saying it's more a product of a current system and the system can change without changing the law.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think at the bottom, perhaps what's driving us is the notion, at least in the United States, that labor law reform is just absolutely impossible. You're never going to it's never going to happen. And so maybe my response is a creative way of extracting myself from that dilemma. But I do think there's something genuinely there. So what's a good example? There's nothing that forces unions to bargain, they're not obligated to put in a union shop or for exclusive representation or to have the full huge menu of collective bargaining terms, right? So there's nothing that imposes, I don't think anything in the law that requires having all those things. There are tools that make it easier for unions to get them, but it's not mandatory in any way. And so, I don't think, nothing would prohibit a union from bargaining with Walmart on a members-only basis, not trying to get exclusive representation, and keeping the bargaining agenda relatively simple at a few core issues. And so I don't, to sort of get that kind of structure, I don't think you need labor law reform. I think the labor law as it's developed in the United States has come about because unions have bargained on a decentralized basis, and those are the kinds of tools that help them bargain best in that way: exclusive representation, the union shop, but nothing requires it. And so, for that reason, I don't, that if you wanted to change union structures without changing the law, I think that would be possible.
We got some scholars in Canada who have been sort of banging the drum for minority unionism for quite a long time. Roy Adams, particularly, who works in just around the corner from the master. But one problem that I've never seen satisfactorily answered with respect to minority unionism is how do you protect employee rights in that situation? If you ask Roy Adams that question, he'll say, well, just let the minority union strike, which pushes you back to the situation Britain was in the 1960s. In other words, total chaos. One group of employees wasn't happy with what another group with the treatment because it wasn't getting benefits given to another group of employees. It would simply down tools until the employer complied. How do you and what's happened? I gathered in Germany and the Netherlands is that because of the centralization within unions, your first point, although minority unionism is theoretically possible in practice, it doesn't exist. Once a union comes in and organizes a group of employees, the benefits of that collective bargaining get extended either by law or in practice to everyone. So if you've got a system of actual minority unionization, and especially in the rather extreme Walmart case that you mentioned, where you've got one group of employees in a particular Walmart store who are union represented and then another group are not, how do you prevent effectively the employer from discriminating against the minority who are represented?
Yeah, the minority that aren't represented.
No,
That are represented?
that
Are
are
represented.
represented by the union.
Yeah, I mean,
Unless you unless you give the union total freedom to strike.
right. So, you know, I think there's a natural incentive for employers to extend the identical union terms to all employees, right? If they don't extend the terms of the contract that the union has settled with the minority, they basically give a reason for everyone to join the union, right? Because if the terms only apply to the union members, right, and they don't want to give any more, unless they're very, very intransigent, right? But they don't want to give any more. They don't want to give any more than they have to. So their employer's natural incentive, I think, is to extend the terms of the minority agreement to all employees across the board. I think that's the most likely scenario, and that's a very strong practice in most European countries where you have this big divergence between density and coverage, and in fact, it gets, you know, I think it's such an ingrained practice that you find a lot of legal support for it that's developed often kind of in a common law way. I think both in Sweden and even Germany, that's kind of been the path of development. So, I mean, I think the big hump you have to get over is having enough critical mass of workers, right? Even if it's a minority, you have to have, when confronting an employer like Walmart, you have to have enough to at least get to Walmart to concede on something and not totally oppose the union. To get to that point, you are going to have to strike and make a lot of noise and a lot of problems for the employer. Once you get over that hump, the problem is containing that, right? This was the British problem, right? Is essentially, in my understanding of the British situation, is you had these very autonomous shop steward organizations at the local level who could call a strike whenever they wanted and weren't constrained by the union authority. So this is where, so to prevent something like that from happening, this is where unions really need to get their own organization under control and centralized, right? Otherwise you are going to have that kind of uncontrolled chaos. And so if unions can fix the centralization problem within their own organization, I think they'll be in a place to use strike action when it's necessary, but to contain it when it's not. In a way, you know, so the really interesting comparison to the U.S. when comparing against Sweden that Peter Swenson does in his book is that, you know, it's virtually the same year. The equivalent union in the United States, the machinists, agreed with the with an employers association in the United States for a contract that was in many ways identical to the Swedish agreement. What the employers wanted in both cases was basically right to manage. Right, they didn't want any of these minute restrictions of rules within the workplace, and they wanted open shop. In exchange, they would let the union bargain for wages that covered the industry. In Sweden, you had centralized unions that could control strike funds and prevent the local unions from going above that agreement, right? In the United States, all the locals completely balked at this agreement and struck because they didn't want to give employers management rights, and they wanted to close shop. And so basically the machinist union at the central level couldn't deliver because they didn't have the authority to control the local level. And then after that, employers were like, you know, what good are you? And that's when they really mounted an offensive campaign against the union. So, so there's a lot of things going on there, and they do have to come together well for it to work.
Just going back to where we were just talking about how the law is a consequence or a cause of the whole situation that we're in right now, we're in the States. What are your thoughts on the NLRB, I guess going back in time a couple of years or a few years or even a few months, the postering in workplaces?
Yeah, whether to require employers to post their rights.
Is that more causal, or would that necessarily be?
I mean, well, I guess when I talk about cause, you know, the content of the law, the rules themselves, are they the shape that it takes? Is that a result of bargaining structures, or does it cause bargaining structures? And so I guess I'm having a hard time seeing where the postering requirement sort of fits into that.
I never get a chance to ask these questions.
I mean, the way I looked at that, it was the board's attempt to try and, right there, in a lot of ways, that move was to try and get the Employee Free Choice Act through the back door, right? It was the postering, but there were a lot of other rules they wanted to apply that they couldn't get through legislation. And so what were the content of those rules? Well, they wanted to increase sanctions on employers that opposed unions. They wanted to have first contract arbitration, and then there was a third element that I'm not remembering. But all those features, to me, are precisely a product of decentralized union. Why? Because it addresses employer opposition, which is, again, endemic, I think, to decentralized bargaining. And so in that way, again, the content of those rules, I think, is very reflective of a decentralized bargaining regime, which is not to say they couldn't work, right? So again, to place this in the Canadian context, one option is to try and revive the Wagner model, just increase the sanctions, stay within a decentralized context, and that possibly could work, right? I mean, it seems to be working relatively well in Canada. If we just had the right labor law, maybe we could shore up decentralized unionism in the United States. And I guess I think that is, I think that's a perfectly feasible choice. And I guess what I'm saying, looking from the American context, is that's one possibility. Maybe with density so low, however, maybe we should think about something else. And maybe why is because, even if we went back to, if we just shored up the decentralized model, I'm not sure that in the long term how stable it is, right? So again, unions are under attack everywhere, but I think they tend to be much more stable, much more accepted in countries where they're more centralized than in countries like the United States where they're more decentralized. So.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, we can wrap the session up. Thank you for a very stimulating talk.
Yeah, thank you for your excellent questions.